Hello, welcome to another Seeds of Flourishing episode. So in endeavour to make these Seeds of Flourishing episodes as spontaneous as possible, which was my original plan, this week, in the usual slot that I sort of reserve for music discovery or popular culture, something of that nature, or discovery of any type that isn't philosophical discovery or pure philosophical discovery, I wanted to talk about a book I've just started reading. This came out on February the 8th of 2022, so it took me a while to pick the book up. I am actually pretty aware of Chuck Klosterman. In fact, I can remember, there should be a list of his books here. Yeah, remember this, I actually got this as a gift from my wife. Actually, before we were married, I remember getting this this box through the mail when I was still living in the UK, and in the box for my birthday, it had a copy of this Fargo Rock City, which I devoured, a Alexis on Fire t-shirt, and one of those like a tag, and you can hear it, you know the sort I mean, like a sort of dog tag type thing, but it had like a little, I don't even know what you call it. It wasn't really a sigil, but it was a series of letters which had sort of special meaning at the time. We used to call it Heavy Metal Hugs and Kisses. I've literally worn that dog tag every day since then, and it's like a stainless steel one, and it's rather impressive actually. It's never corroded or anything. So yeah, that's on me all the time. So yeah, that always reminds me of this. So I still have this book. Obviously, it's a keepsake, and I've read other of his books. I taught a presentation once where I was talking about the nature of evil, and I can remember reading this book for a bit of research, a bit of background research. I was just trying to work out how to frame it. And then on another occasion, I think I bought this as well. I actually, bizarrely, I gave these away. I don't know quite what was on my mind. I kept this one, but I gave these two away. I think mainly because I bought them for research purposes and thought I probably wouldn't read them again, and now rather regret my choice, although I could probably pick all of these up on as ebooks anyway, so it's no big deal. And I've also seen him on various interviews. He's very intense is the wrong word actually. I like the way he really gets underneath it, whatever he's reflecting on, and most of it is related to popular culture or sports as well, which is part of popular culture. And he with a lot of these books actually, this got pretty philosophical, and I find a lot of his works, he often has quite a philosophical framework he works through, and the books, you can sort of read each chapter as almost like an essay, really. I mean, some of his books are particularly a collection of articles and essays, but in some ways, other books which riff around certain subjects a lot closer, you can almost read it as a series of essays, and I get that impression. I'm actually working my way through the audiobook and reading this simultaneously, and I sort of get the same impression with that as well. Each chapter can be read in its own right, but they work well as a complete work. So back to the the book in hand. So yeah, I've been working my way through this. Obviously, one of the reasons I wanted to do it is I just wanted to revisit the 90s, and it served that purpose. So I thought I'd do just a video reflecting on the 90s, and some of these things the book does touch on, but I just thought it would be an interesting video to just go back to that period. And he talks a lot about Nevermind in the book. There's a whole chapter on, I think, on grunge widely, and again he really gets underneath, under the bonnet of things, and really starts to think quite heavily. And there's a really interesting chapter on the internet, and also the nature of recorded music and the format in which it's released on, which, as you know, there was a massive shift when you compare the 90s going into the 2000s. So I thought it'd be interesting to go to the popular culture page of Wikipedia, or the section for the 1990s, and just scroll down this, just to place us back in that era. So Seinfeld, Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive, grunge stars were popular. I'll see if I can jump back also and find if there's a UK version of this, because it's interesting what was going on in the UK in the tail end of the 90s as well, music-wise. I think that's rare. Would be, well, actually, what am I saying? So I'm jumping back a bit further. I'm thinking about tail end of the 80s. But yeah, the 80s into the 90s, and when grunge hit, the UK charts was really interesting, like the diversity of the music that was there. In the late 80s, bands like the Stone Roses had been really popular, and there was a whole Manchester scene, and that then led into all these different diverse genres of rock music and pop music that incorporated dance elements or psychedelia, or just pure pure pop, or just lots of things. It was this massive sort of musical smorgasbord at the time in the UK, and grunge was one of those things that came in. So again, the internet, I think I mentioned that, Nintendo 64, Crystal Pepsi, Rugrats, Beavis and Butthead, The Simpsons, Ren and Stimpy. He doesn't mention all of these things in the book, but different aspects are sort of touched on as you go through the book. Highest grossing film of the decade was Titanic. We had Star Trek TNG at that period. It's not mentioned it here, but I can remember in the 90s I'd moved jobs, and I'd previously worked in microbiology for about 11, 12 years, and then worked completely changed careers because I wanted to get into more sort of computing, and went and worked in a environment that did point of sale and computing, like front end support. And at the same time I decided to do my postgrad in computing and manufacturing. And I can remember mid-90s doing assignments on a Sunday, and I used to always start my assignments like really early, like literally a month before, and then slowly work through them really slowly. And around the time I used to do them, I'd have Babylon 5 on in the background. It would go out on a Sunday afternoon, and I'd watch that. So Babylon 5 was a big thing in the 90s, well, in the UK, and I imagine in North America as well. What do we got? Toy Story, Avatar. Of course. Yep, Studio Ghibli. Yeah, that was the other thing. And this is interesting, actually. The the Academy Award winners. Just looking through these. Oh, of course, yeah, he talks about Pulp Fiction as well in the book, and more specifically Quentin Tarantino as well. And of course, 1999, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I can remember going to see this in some really tiny cinema in a town in Sussex called East Grinstead, and they had this tiny couple of cinemas at the site of a previous cinema that had been redeveloped, and they were at the top of this building. I'm trying to even remember the name of the building. I know the bar in there, I think it's called the Crow's Nest. And they had these two cinemas there, and it was like the hottest day of the year. I decided to take a break from, I think at that point I was writing a dissertation, and I decided to take a break from doing it one afternoon. And I went down there. I can remember walking through East Grinstead town centre in flipping cycling shorts, I think, and like a t-shirt. It was just really, really hot for the UK. This was also the year that the 90s was when the X-Files film came out. He touches on the X-Files as well, briefly. But all of I think I've watched quite a number of these, like The Matrix, and I'm only about like 2/3 of the way through the book, so I don't know if at what point The Matrix will get mentioned. I remember The Mummy, although I didn't get into that until The Mummy 2. Here we go. 1990s in music. I'll include this link actually in the description as well, so you can go through. Here we go. I was hoping it would do this, so I wouldn't have to jump around. So yeah, of course, 91 was when Freddie Mercury died. So let me just see if this marries up with my memory. So yeah, Britpop, the whole what's called Cool Britannia. There's a couple of really good documentaries on that have been uploaded to YouTube actually about Cool Britannia. So we've got Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Suede, Supergrass, Elastica. The other thing they don't mention here, which I was really into or listening to a lot on the charts at the time, was the whole Bristol scene, the trip hop stuff, and that was charting. And then of course we had Spice Girls and a number of other boy bands like E17, Boyzone. See, it's funny, I've always associated Sade more with the 80s, but clearly they mention it here, so she must have been maintained her popularity in the 90s. Oh, there you go. Here's where I am now, Canada. So, of course, Alanis Morissette and Shania Twain. Yeah. Manic Street Preachers, Radiohead as well. Oh, and rave music. Yeah, so the late 80s in the UK were interesting. So I think it was around 88, 80, 89. The whole rave culture and like illegal raves and warehouse stuff, illegal warehouse raves and various other things, and people having big sort of dance parties in the middle of fields, in the middle of nowhere. There was a big crackdown. It was like the bane of the government at the time. And it was there was a lot of like dissent in the UK at that time around that, and also the aftermath of the so-called poll tax and all the poll tax riots. So a lot of bands around that time in the late 80s really flourished in the 90s in the UK. A lot of bands off the back of the rave movement. Things like 808 State, The Shaman, the KLF, Prodigy. And then if you're a big sort of metal fan or extreme music fan, the 90s is a really interesting period as well, with bands like Pantera, obviously moving away from their glam metal roots and into groove metal, and just these really interesting sub-genres as well. I mean, during the early to mid 90s was when I was probably more into a lot of the stuff off of the back of Britpop and a lot of the stuff off the back of rave and trip hop. And I was still listening to like extreme music in the 90s, but I wasn't so familiar. I was more familiar with the mainstream bands, like, the Panteras, and the Metallicas and people like that. And it wasn't until 97 that I really started to realise there was this whole load of other extreme metal bands that I had no knowledge of. I mean, I was aware of bands like, from the Florida death metal scene, like the more earlier 90s, but there were bands like, oh dear me, I should have looked this up before I started to talk about it, because now my brain's gone a little blank on that. It'll come back to me. Typo Negative was one band, and bands like Stuck Mojo, and I'm trying to think of the other band that I discovered who'd been around for a long time and I've been aware of. I know Paradise Lost was one, and Anathema was another, and My Dying Bride as well. So a lot of the doom death bands as well that I hadn't really picked up on. Oops, sorry. And other bands like Cathedral as well. So pretty interesting time. Late 90s, it was nice because I revisited a lot of genres that I was already aware of, but had sort of moved away from a little bit, and then came back, and it was interesting to see how things had moved on. And also I can remember walking into a large Virgin megastore, and they were playing one of the Ministry albums. Is it Jehovah? I think it's called. I never get the name right. Sorry, Psalm 69. So that came out in 92, and they were playing. What's the lead track on there? New World Order. I thought, what the hell is this? Like nothing I'd heard of before, because most of the industrial I'd heard of wasn't quite so metallic, and I hadn't got into bands like Godflesh at that point either. Most of the industrial stuff that I was aware of was more stuff that had come in from sort of dance or the German stuff. Again, my brain's gone slightly blank on this, but I'm trying to remember the band that were quite extreme and used to like bash up metal plates on stage and use road drills and those sort of things. So it was really interesting to see, that, or experience the whole genre metal thing, industrial metal genre. Yes, obviously I was aware of Killing Joke and TG, although I don't think I listened to much Throbbing Gristle. Let me refresh my memory here. Industrial. So, Skinny Puppy, that's it. Well, they weren't the band that bashed metal, I don't think. But, yeah, I was aware of bands like Frontline Assembly and Front 242. Frontline Assembly, I think, was the first album I bought on CD in the early 90s. Because I hadn't got into CDs for quite a while. I've gone down an interesting rabbit hole here. Oh, that's annoying. I wish I could remember the name of it. Oh, there we go. I won't try and say it. You know who I mean. And the other band I'm thinking of is actually SPK, who went a bit more dancey in later albums. And then just moving on to television. Oh, Beverly Hills 90210. Wow. And of course, the other thing, that whole expansion of the Star Wars universe, not Star Wars, Star Trek universe as well. At that time. Simpsons, South Park. Oh yeah, body modification. Do you remember those? Oh, and Pogs. Oh, there we go. Doom, yeah, so... Yeah, that was the first game I bought for my first computer that I purchased for home. Was Doom, and that series featuring, was it Lord British, which was it Ultima Underworld 2, and things like StarCraft. Wow, this brings back memories. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see as I get towards the end of the book how much he touches on video games. Because the other interesting thing in the 90s, from what I remember, is that there was that interesting shift from consoles over to PC games as PCs became more powerful. I noticed like a bit of a shift. And then sort of back again as the consoles got more powerful. Harry Potter, John Grissom, Goosebumps. I list all the actors who were prevalent in the 90s. And also the musician. That's a pretty interesting article, actually. So I will include the link to that. So that was a bit of a rambly episode, but I just wanted to talk about something I was really enjoying at the moment, and certainly reading this book just opened up my whole week to re-exploring the 90s. And then the other interesting thing is he gets into a really interesting, almost philosophical discussion about the nature of periods in time like the 90s and how people like nostalgically look back. And there's elements of discussions about presentism in there, but he doesn't specifically mention that term. And so that it's really fascinating how he's sort of tying in the way we perceive decades and how we are affected by certain technological changes So, we're in the 90s, and we're not quite into that period where file sharing was huge. We were sort of getting there, but that for me in the UK was more the 2000s. All the sort of things were lining up, I suppose, to make that happen. So internet speeds were getting faster. It was into the 2000s. In the 2000s, when I eventually started working for myself, I was starting to see broadband come online. I was starting to see internet through cable, which meant faster internet speeds, which helped facilitate all the file sharing stuff that happened. But the thing about the 90s, you were still very much in that spot where exploring certain musical genres or just even bands, incurred a certain financial constraint to it, a reasonably high financial constraint. And he talks about the cost of CDs and various other things, which once we had, almost like unlimited file sharing, and then we moved into the world of streaming, where they managed to make people pay, even if it is a small amount, for music again, or persuaded people to pay for music again. How suddenly being, in the 90s, going from still at that certain constraint to almost like this free-for-all where you could listen to almost anything, and there was no, or relatively small, financial hit in doing that, and how that completely changed. Now you had not just music but information generally as we got into in the 2000s at our fingertips, which you didn't have in the 90s. And it's interesting to hear him sort of contrast the different frameworks and other things as well. So yeah, it's a cool book to read. I managed to track mine down through my local library through a service called Libby, and they had actually copies of both the book and the audio book. I've returned the audio book, but I've still got the ebook because I want to reread a few things, and I fell asleep a couple of times when I was listening to the audio book as well. That's no reflection on Chuck Klosterman, but I find, I do find sometimes if I'm listening to stuff at night, I have a habit of falling asleep to ebooks. So that's really all I want to talk about in this episode. So yeah, check out the book. If you don't want to check out the book, then check out the Wikipedia article and see, either if you're of a certain age, and he also gets into the discussions about, the age of certain people when they experience the 90s as well, which is really always fascinating. And so, yeah, it's an interesting period in time to either visit for the first time or to revisit if you lived through it, regardless of your age as well. Although obviously that has a bearing on, how you, re-experience it, obviously. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next video.